Thank you again for those I didn't get to talk to during the earlier hour. I'd still be around to talk at the end if you want to hear more of the specifics about World Witness and what we do. But World Witness is the foreign mission agency of the Associate Reformed Presbyterian denomination, which is the denomination that you guys are a part of. And so today I'm just going to share from the Word on Isaiah 49, 1 through 6 about where we get our motivation to do what we're doing. But I do want to be available at the end after we're finished if you have very specific questions about the work that we are doing. I went to Citadel. I like the idea of missions and spy novels, and I like Tom Cruise movies, Mission Impossible stuff. I'm probably a pretty big wimp. If it came into like an action situation, I probably most likely would freeze. But I'm always looking for a good spy book. And a friend of mine who was a professor at Furman had a spy book. He said, this is the classic spy novel. You have to read this. If you don't like it, whatever you think of spy novels is the one you should read. It's called The Spy That Came In From the Cold. Has anybody read that book, the classic spy? You're shaking your head, yes? So The Spy That Came In From the Cold is about a man who is trying to work in East Germany and pull assets out and put them back in, and he gets personally involved with another one. In the end, he gets too involved with one of the assets, the person that he's training, and commits like double suicide with them in the face of being caught by the enemy. And it ends completely dark, completely black. And I kept looking for another page, like at the end of the book, thinking, well, where's the redemption in this? It was such a depressing book. I guess it was well written. And sometimes you just don't, people recommend books to you and you're just like, well, just not my genre or just not my thing. But this book ended with such a deep darkness. I felt deep. I was like, wow, that was deep. But like, I'm so sad right now. And the mission is totally over with no apparent success. So, I don't know if you take that as a recommendation to read it or not. If that's the kind of book you're into, go for it. But the setting today in the book of Isaiah in chapter 49 is one of mission over. The people of Israel were to be God's people to declare to the nations who God was. And now they have been moved out of the land that they were promised in Israel, and they've been moved now to Babylon. In fact, they're told to settle down, get married, buy land, have kids, get jobs. God didn't say, forget about it, all the promises that are to come, but for several generations, you're in timeout. He's mad at them. He's continually given them opportunity to repent of the idols that they didn't do. And finally, they even choose a king, which begins the slow process of showing that God wasn't their king. They wanted an earthly king. They didn't want a godly king. So God sticks them in timeout in Babylon. But during this timeout, we still have the prophecies from Isaiah, who is allowing us to see the glimpses of God's promise that he will use Israel to proclaim his salvation to the nations. So that's the context for Isaiah chapter 49. So if you want to open there, let's see what mission God is still proclaiming that they, Israel, will have. Isaiah 49, 1 through 6. Listen to me, O coastlands, and give attention, you peoples from afar. The Lord called me from the womb, from the body of my mother. He named me by name. He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. In his quiver he hid me away. And he said to me, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. But I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing in vanity. Yet surely my right is with the Lord, and my recompense with my God. And now the Lord says, he who formed me from his womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the eyes of the Lord, and my God has become my strength. He says, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob, to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth. Lord, let these words, let your revelation of who you are be to us this day. Glory to you and life to us. In Jesus' name, amen. So who is this message going to? People of the coastlands, Charlestonians. When I hear that and I'm in Charleston, I think Charlestonians. But also you people from afar. So it's the idea of coast to coast. So the message here was for the people in Babylon, but the audience was meant to be global. How they would ever think this would be a global proclamation in little old Babylon, well, big old Babylon, I don't know. But this was supposed to be a global message. The Lord called me from the womb, from the body of my mother. He named my name. Now, many of you had names picked out for you before you were born. Some of you maybe later. I don't know. Did anybody have their name changed like a few days later? But the name that was this servant was going to be was before even the conception of it. In other words, who this servant was to be and the mission the servant was to carry out was preconceived, or let's say decreed by God, long before anyone would know what the servant looked like. We're probably wondering, who is the servant? We've got some ideas. We'll clear that up in just a little bit. Verse 2, he made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. In his quiver he hid me away. The servant, whoever the servant is armed. The servant has two instruments of attack. One of them is a sharp sword, and the other is a polished arrow. Now, a sword is, of course, a close combat weapon. Occasionally you'll see a show where a guy will throw a sword halfway across the room and kill somebody, but that's not typically the use of a sword. The sword is for close quarter combat. Now, an arrow is quite different. And a polished arrow, one that is raised up and clean. Now, an arrow's purpose, of course, is artillery. These are the artillery people of the Old Testament. So an arrow is taken and launched out. So, again, just to get the imagery here, we have two ways that the servant will carry out the mission. One close and one far. Who is the servant? This is where it gets tricky. You read the Old Testament and you're like, man, that could be Jesus. Whoever that is, I think it's Jesus. All of a sudden the text seems to change in such a radical way. Like, oh, that's not Jesus anymore. Like somebody, we got off the Jesus boat on that one. But maybe this is the people of Israel. Or was it Jacob? Wasn't Jacob named Israel? Who is Israel again? And then you know from the New Testament that Israel is also referred to as the church. So whose servant is it anyway? Who are we talking about here in verse 3? You are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Israel here, from the text and elsewhere in Isaiah and within this own chapter, which we won't read right now, we know is referred to as actually the people. So there is an actual designation that the servant itself are the people of Israel. What I'm speaking about is ethnic Jews, right there on the spot. Secondly, we also know this to be the church. And thirdly, we also, of course, know it to be Jesus Christ. So let's solve it this way. Israel here is the people of Israel as they should have been, but were not. It is the church as it ought to be. And it is Jesus Christ as he is forever and through all time. Again, it is Israel as it should have been. The church as it may or at least ought to be. And Jesus Christ as he is for all time. Verse 4, I have labored in vain. I've spent my strength for nothing in vanity. Yet surely my right is with the Lord, and my recompense with my God. And now the Lord says, he who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, and that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the eyes of the Lord, and my God has become my strength. At this point, we need to look at the text and figure out who are all the people at play for whom the message is for. So the message is a message of mission. This is your mission, Israel. This is what you're supposed to be doing. We haven't actually gotten to the clearest understanding of that. We won't get till 6. If you want to read ahead at 6, you can kind of skip ahead. But right here, we need to figure out now, who is this message to be used upon? And here we have Jacob in verse 5, to bring Jacob back to him, that Israel might be gathered to him. Bringing Jacob back to him, that Israel might be gathered to him. Jacob. ARPs. Families. That's kind of Jacob. Ethnic ARPs. Now I know many of you in here are not ARP background. That is fine. You are just as saved as anyone else. Maybe more so. I don't know. But there are churches in the denomination that you're in that have strong family names, and they consider themselves familial as a characteristic of their church and our denomination. We need lots more family to come in. But that designation is what Jacob means here. In other words, the people of Israel that were marked about, or excuse me, people who are preserved Jacob, right here are basically ethnic Jews in their midst. Again, those who would be genetically ARP, I don't know if you can say it that way. But then secondly, what's the other group that we have here? We have Israel itself. Now, Israel is an expanded version of that. Think Rahab. Think of the people that are brought into it from the outside. So if you are here today and you're a member of this church, you are Jacob. Everybody outside the church this morning is Israel yet to be gathered. These are your neighbors. And then we know the third party is in verse 6, it's the nations. And we're going to get to that in a little bit. But my family and I spent a good number of years in the Middle East in missions. And we moved back here 5 years ago to take the job of director for this agency. And initially, when we landed, I was pretty pumped for the gospel. Just coming off the field, looking for Muslims, looking for an opportunity to share. And honestly, I don't live in a neighborhood where there's any Muslims that I know of. I live around good old, normal, secular, quasi-secular, quasi-religious, fully religious, evangelicals, non-evangelicals, Catholics. It's a mix. Everybody in my neighborhood kind of says they go to church, or at least they've seen a church, or at least they know a Christian. So our radar's up for like a true non-Christian. But actually what we typically have is just semi-Christians who may or may not be saved and do or don't want to go deeper in their faith. Although our next door neighbors, when we first moved in, were like, it was exciting. We're so sure they're not Christians just by everything we see. There's no way, which was exciting. And initially, their daughter ran away. And I went over and asked to pray for them, and I just freaked them out when I asked to pray for them. And that just set us apart for like years. Like they wouldn't really talk to us. And it took me reading Rosario Butterfield's The Gospel Comes with a House. I can't recommend that book enough. The Gospel Comes with a House by Rosario Butterfield. Reopened my eyes to my own local mission. We are going to go into the global mission in this sermon. But if you're not a local missionary, then giving the global missions is a little bit hypocritical. Because we have a mission ourselves, and there's none of us that are exempt from it. So in reading Rosario Butterfield's book, it's about extreme hospitality. It's so, in some ways, it makes you feel very guilty. It's like listening to a John Piper sermon over and over and over because you're not doing enough. So just take it with a grain of salt. But I felt very guilty. So we decided to make another effort to reach out to these neighbors, and we just started inviting them. They would come up with excuses, until finally one night, I nailed them down and said, hey, how about dinner? And they're like, no, but after dinner. And I said, oh, really, after dinner? And they're like, oh, yeah, okay, after dinner. And so they've got their deck next to us, and we're sitting out there, and I pull some refreshments out, and I'm sitting on the deck waiting, because our dinner's over. And I don't know if their dinner's over, but he goes outside to smoke or something. And then my daughter, Abigail, or Lisa, is on the deck, and she looks up and sees him from the deck. I'm sitting in a place where they can't see me, but my daughter can see him, and she's just wondering, is he going to come over or not? And she's sitting there looking at him, and it's probably, it's a good distance, but all of a sudden she goes, oh, Dad, he's looking at me. What do I do? And I just said, she was just frozen like a deer in the headlights, and he's just sitting there looking at her going, why are you staring at me, kid? And so I kind of come over and get in front of my daughter, like, hey, we're still welcome over here. He's like, oh, yeah, I'll be there in a second. So he actually brings his whole family, and we talk and laugh for a couple of hours. And it was a new point in our relationship. But it took a book like that reminded me of my local mission. It's the mission that we all have here. It's to be not only centripetal, gathering in of people, but also the idea of reaching out as well. It's what's in your neighborhood. It's all around you. And it really took me a long time. As a career missionary, it took me a long time to realize that own task that I had. Because many of you've talked to your neighbors, you've lived next to them too long. what do you do now? You can't, like, if you start inviting them now, it's kind of like weird or something, right? You've said hello to them. It's been too casual relationship to all of a sudden go deep, right? My encouragement to you is just pray. Pray for opportunity. Give it a good 6 months of praying for opportunity, and then watch God give you something something you could not conceive of. That's just my challenge. 6 months, pray for your neighbors, and just watch and wait and see what God does. God has become the strength of this servant in verse 6. It's not in our strength that we save. It is in the strength of God. And I want to tell a short story about Adoniram Judson, who was the first American missionary that we sent out. Adoniram Judson was raised as a preacher's kid but became a deist through a friend of his named James Eames. He and Adoniram together went around trying to disprove the gospel, even though he was a preacher's kid. Eventually, James and he were separated for a while, and on his way home, Adoniram stayed at an inn. And next to him in this inn was a dying man in agony all night. And he listened to this guy's in throes of death. He couldn't see him. There was a curtain between them. And the next morning, he asked the innkeeper what happened to the man. The innkeeper said, well, the man died an agonizing death. And they pulled the body out, and it was his friend James Eames. And at that moment, he converted and repented for the way that he had run from the Lord. And then he became one of the most powerful missionaries to be sent out in 1813, went to Burma, which is we know somewhat as Myanmar. In 12 years, he had 18 converts. He was imprisoned in a war camp during a conflict between England and Burma. And when he's released, his wife dies 3 months later, as does his third child. Things started picking up, and missionaries began to double every year until about 1866. And then his second wife died, as did 3 more children, and he slipped into a depression. Then his second wife died, and he traveled back to America just to raise support for the mission itself. And I remember at this time he had about 18 converts, and more missionaries are coming, and now he had translated a Matthean version of the Bible. He'd go on later to translate the rest of the Bible. But back in America, he could barely speak because of a pulmonary disease that he had over and over that had ravaged his lungs. And he finally marries a third time, Emily Chug, who went on to write the memoirs about the second wife, Sarah, who had died. So he finally decided that he wanted to go see Burma one last time because he was dying of this pulmonary disease. And on his way back, within the sight of the shore, he passed away. And as is customary, to not cause disease, they took the body and just dumped it over in the sea. One of the most famous missionaries to ever exist. Lost 2 wives, 5 children, had a handful of converts, and a Bible translated, and died potentially, in my perspective, a failure. Adoniram, over and over in his ministry, remarked that God was his strength, his recompense, his right. Everything that he could do with it was of power, came from God. And no matter what we embark on, no matter what venture or mission that we attempt, it is God's strength that will persevere the end of that work. The story doesn't end there. For many people, it ended there because we didn't have a strong conclusion until just a few years ago, when it became revealed just the impact that Adoniram had. And we will tell that end of the story at the end of the sermon. Verse 6. It is too light a thing to raise up the tribes of Jacob. And to bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Jacob, here you are, Jacob. Israel, here's your Israel. The ends of the earth are the nations. Israel did not understand this idea of centrifugal gospel proclamation. The idea that it was to go outside of their camp to the nations. Truly, Their job was to be centripetal, to be pulled to the middle. In other words, they would show off who God was so much that it would bring the nations to them. In Zechariah, there's a report where it said, and in that day, 2 men would take a hold of a Jew's tassels and follow him to the temple, saying, help, let us go with you. We heard that God is with you. That's the vision, that you are such a community of Christ, such a community in love with him, that it would be that the nations would cling and grab hold of your well, nobody's wearing a tie but me. Grab hold of your tie, grab a hold of something, and say, we heard God is with you. Bring us to the temple today. That was the mission of Israel. But as they time and time again left their God, that mission didn't change, but became clarified in Acts, when we see that Paul says to the Jews, because today you have rejected this message in your hearing, I will take the message to the Gentiles, for we have been made as a light to the nations. Referring back to Isaiah 6, that his salvation would reach the end of the earth. And it says the Gentiles cheered, celebrated, went bonkers, because they realized, to their pleasure, to the Jews' displeasure, that the gospel was for the nations, was for everyone. It was always intended that way. You see, people look at Jesus and they're like, you know what? Jesus really just went to the Jews. It did have a clear mission where he said time and time again, I've come first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. But in the book of Matthew, Jesus visits on the coast of what's today Lebanon. He goes actually on vacation of sorts. And he heals a Canaanite woman's daughter who's demon-possessed, who's begging for some healing. He seemingly rejects her, and actually it's a way of drawing her closer in faith. But he heals a Canaanite's daughter from that. And in that text, right after that story ends, he immediately goes out from there and goes to Decapolis, which is near the Sea of Galilee. But it means literally 10 cities. It is a cities of pure Gentiles. And he pours out a massive healing and a massive feeding that parallels what he did just a few chapters earlier with the Jews and the feeding and the healing that happened there. So you have on balance Jesus, yes, coming first to the Jew, but giving a clear understanding in the New Testament that his word was for the world. This is your word as well for the world. So it is good and delightful that Jacob is here today. And it's beautiful that Israel will grow. You will hopefully re-meet your neighbors again. But it is that we all are to be a polished arrow. We all have the close combat fighting, but we are to be raising young people, slowly polishing them, showing them who Christ is and what he can do for the nations, and then sending them away. My pastor, when I went to the Citadel, was a guy named Buster Brown, who is the pastor of East Cooper Baptist. Does anybody know Buster? I see a few people smiling. Buster's a great guy. I love Buster so much. He discipled me and 3 other cadets for a few years at the Citadel. And towards the end of my senior year, I was trying to think. I didn't really know what to do. At the end of my junior year, I didn't know really what to do. I was kind of going back and forth on the military. And I'd been doing the Ranger Challenge stuff, and I decided I was going to go ahead and be an Army contract, and that I was going to sign for my black badge. And Buster, basically the week I was to sign, we were in a time of prayer together, and he just looks up and says, you know what, Alex, I know you're thinking about the military. He goes, but I think you should consider instead becoming a foreign missionary. And I said, okay. Everything he said to me, I did. I just knew better not to do something. Even a recommendation was like, you should do this. I kind of took it as a second gospel. I said, Buster, you're right. That's exactly what I should do. And that's exactly what I did. Your job in polishing and sending out young arrows is an intentional one. We have an initiative called 2220 where we're asking churches to pray about raising 2 missionaries for the gospel to be sent out at some time in the future. So we're asking Shem Creek ARP. I know you're still a young church. You're still getting in the understanding of what it means to love your neighbors. But always have built into your genetic code that which Israel forgot. That they also have a commission, as small as you may be a light to the nations. It is always to be there. It is always to be here. And consider raising polished arrows from a young age. My own wife herself had a missionary come to her when she was 9 years old. It was 9 years old, and had that missionary get down on her knee and tell her, young lady, I think you could be a missionary one day. And she and I ended up meeting actually in Jordan on the mission field itself. So make those polished arrows from age, and don't be afraid to speak into their lives as they grow older. The conclusion of the story for Adoniram Judson, and be finished. Adoniram Judson seemingly failed. Few disciples and a few translations. And then a number of years ago, I was at a conference in South Africa, and at that conference, a guy presented what I'll call the rest of the story to us who didn't know, and truthfully, I knew nothing about Adoniram Judson at that time either. He comes up and he says, I was at the 100th anniversary of Christianity coming to Burma. And the speaker was asked to present and to show the Bible that was there, presented to him in Burmese, to the Burmese that were gathered there. It's just a symbol of giving them the gospel again. And the person who was presenting was not Burmese himself, didn't speak Burmese. And the Bible was handed to him by his translator, and he opened the Bible. And there in this top left corner was an inscription translated by Adoniram Judson. And the guy who was presenting knew Adoniram Judson. He tested his translator. He's like, do you know who this guy is? And the translator said, yes, sir. The tens of thousands of Burmese Christians today can all trace their spiritual heritage back to Adoniram Judson. His God was his strength. He didn't go out in his own strength. His recompense with his Lord. Surely his right was with God Almighty. When we do missions, when we send arrows out, even when we fight close combat right here with gospel proclamation, it's not in our strength we do it. We are not responsible for the results. That's God's camp. We are responsible for receiving the commission and proclaiming the message. Jacob, Israel, the nations.